Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Redbird's last in this series of Mending the Fabric, Thought Leadership and Change. I am really excited and glad to have Jonathan Varkul with us in this interactive evening of learning, taking your real path, effective thinking in times of stress. And we're going to walk through this process together. So feel free to jump in when you want to, raise your hand, put something in the chat box. But mostly for this evening, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, and he's going to be our guide. So welcome.
Great, thanks, Barbara. What I'm going to do is share my screen first, and then we'll, let me just see if that's what I want. Okay, can everyone, I'm assuming everyone can see that. All good? Okay, so that's the thumbs up there. Okay, perfect. So, so for those of you who aren't aware of what I do, I'm a coach and a facilitator and an advisor for senior leaders. But the vast majority of my work is really helping leaders navigate complex challenges. And so I didn't start out doing this work. I actually started out as a CPA and then spent 4 years in an audit practice with Ernst & Young, and then 4 years as a software consultant in the ERP software space, and then 8 years as part of a senior team building a technology company. And so while I've spent a lot of time grounded in the day-to-day practicalities on the surface of life, which is like the stuff we can easily see and easily comprehend, I've also been captivated by its depth, which is the less obvious aspects of life, exploring questions such as what's the nature of reality and who or what am I really? Now, as part of my desire to explore the deeper side of things, meditation practices, mindfulness practices, spiritual exploration, these have all been an integral part of my day-to-day since the late 90s. And in 2010, I decided to leave my role with OpenLane, which was a technology company that I had been working for, to answer a burning question. Like, what would it be like to bring these two parts of my life together and see if the deeper aspect of my life could offer anything of value in solving complex business problems? So now my coaching practice is really the expression of this endeavor or exploration. And it's where I kind of dance on the bridge between the boardroom and the meditation cushion. And this evening, I'm going to share a framework that comes out of some of this dancing. And so the title of this evening's webinar is part of a broader webinar series, which is Mending the Fabric, which offers different perspectives on how we can bring more healthy functioning into the world. And so this evening's webinar is really about enhancing our relationships with our thinking, especially when we're stressed. And so the plan for this webinar is to be experiential. So you're going to actually experience some of what we're going to talk about. It's not going to be just theory. And I'll be leading you through a few exercises. And in addition to that, just to realize that engaging in the exercises is really key to learning the concepts. So I encourage everyone on the call to shut down anything distracting and really try your best to engage as best you can. Now, in addition, the plan is for the session to be interactive. So you get to ask questions throughout the webinar. And there are some times when I'll be asking for a couple of volunteers to participate with me in an exercise, and we can do that. So before I move on, are we all good with the plan so far? All cool. Okay, fantastic. So I'm getting the thumbs up from Barbara, so I can go over to our next slide. So good place to start is maybe take a moment and think about a meaningful problem or challenge that you have. It's one that you kind of really have to solve, and it needs to be meaningful to you and also not easy to solve. Now, you're not going to be asked to share it. So it could be personal and difficult and meaningful, and you don't have to worry about sharing it, but take a moment and just think about it. And when you have one that you can think about, raise your hands, let me know that you've kind of all got one. Okay, so as you start to think about this problem that you have, this really personal, difficult, and meaningful problem, notice what it feels like in your body when you start thinking about your problem. Think harder about your problem. What does your body feel like when you start to think more? Think harder. What does it look like? What does this problem start to look like when you think about that? Take a moment. Sit with that for a moment and notice. Now, is there anyone here who'd like to share what it just feels like in their body when they start to think about their problem?
Feel free to just unmute and share, or you can put it in the chat box.
Now,
I have feelings of anxiousness.
right, isn't that interesting? Great. And if you had to say where in your body the anxiousness is, I'm probably willing to bet it's not in your right toe, and it's probably not in your baby finger. So let's exclude the right toe and the baby finger, and let's see where in your body would the anxiousness you think would be most present for you.
Chris is sharing that he's getting, or they are getting a tight chest and hard to breathe. That was
Okay, so it's in the chest.
feeling. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so fantastic. Now, it's interesting is typically when we ask a group of people to think about a problem of theirs, as you'd expect, everyone thinks about a different problem. So we have as many different problems as there are people in the group. However, there's actually a very narrow and limited set of related sensations that everyone starts to feel when they start to think about their problem. And 3 of the most common sensations that people feel in their bodies is a sense of agitation. So we start to feel like we want to move. I can't sit still. It's just too uncomfortable to sit still. Or a sense of constriction, which is a little bit more like a tightening up. Or a sense of tension, which is this rigidity that you start to feel in your muscles and in your body. And all of these, they don't all happen. Not everyone experiences all of them, but in some way we experience something like that, and they're all experienced as quite discomforting. Now, what's really interesting is that when we try to address a problem or a challenge, or we're engaging in stressful situations, the corresponding sensations that we feel are not normally what we focus on or even what we're aware of. Instead, we focus mainly or exclusively on our thoughts about the problem, and we often become lost in it, in the noise of our problem. And this makes it very difficult for us to even discern what's most relevant to addressing it. So for tonight, it's going to be an interesting thing to try and explore is, could the sensations or feelings in our body actually help with solving complex problems? Or could they increase the effectiveness of our thinking when we're under pressure? So to address that question, let's start with a simple model, and then we'll do a little experiment. The image that you can see contains a set of 2 arrows. One's horizontal, one's vertical. The horizontal arrow represents our thinking. You can go for miles in this horizontal direction on a floor, just thinking from one thing to the next to the next. That's just our thinking. The vertical arrow represents the sensations we feel. And we're always at the intersection of these 2 dimensions. So whatever we're doing and wherever we are, we're always thinking something and we're always feeling something, even if we aren't always aware of it. And by feeling something, I'm referring to the experience of the sensation in our bodies, not emotional feelings. And so just like when we started to think about a problem, you could suddenly draw your attention to the fact that you actually felt something. But we're always feeling something, even if I draw attention to the fact that, how does it feel to have your bum on the chair right now? And suddenly you realize, oh, I'm actually feeling that too. So any questions so far before we move on to explore it a little further? All good?
I have one question.
Yep.
Why is paying attention to the physical sensation important?
Why is paying attention to the physical sensation important? We're about to actually get onto that. So it's a great question. So the starting point is we always seem to pay attention to the thinking aspect, which is the horizontal dimension. And typically when when we're stressed, it can only offer us so much in terms of possibility. And so the question that we're trying to explore is, well, what would happen if instead we paid attention to the vertical dimension or the sensation rather than the horizontal? I don't know what would happen, but let's see what happens. It's going to be an interesting exploration. So if we, so what we're going to do right now, just to explore it further, is we're actually going to explore that sensation and vertical dimension and see what impact it can have on our thoughts when we feel stress or pressure. And then we're going to see, is it actually of any usefulness or not? So first, if you're still thinking about or dwelling about your problem, stop thinking about it. You don't need to think about it for now. We may bring it back in a little bit. But instead for now, maybe sit with both feet on the ground and take your dominant hand. And so for me, it's my right hand. Some people, it might be their left. And plop it, palm faced upwards like this, on your lap. So you just plop it on your lap. And now focus, take all your attention and just focus it on the sensation of the palm of your hand. So on your hand. So you just focus your attention just on the sensation of your hand. Now, the nice thing about this is that if your feet are on the ground, then the ground is holding your legs. And so then your lap is relaxed because it's being held by your feet on the ground. And so your hand is being held by your lap. So now your shoulder is being held, your elbow can relax, your whole body can totally relax, and you can just put attention just on the sensation of your hand. So take a moment and just sit like that, just keeping your attention focused on the sensation of your hand. Now, some people start to think about whether they're getting it right or what should the sensation feel like. And the truth is, there is no right or wrong to what the sensation should feel like. It's just we're activating a particular part of the brain that deals with sensation, conveys sensation. It's the parietal lobe. So if I touch my forehead, I feel sensation just by doing that. It's the same. We're activating it just by putting attention on what it feels like to be with sensation in our hand. So everyone's experience is going to be perfectly good. And no matter what it is, it's perfectly fine. The key is to just focus what's there and just feel it. Okay, so see if you can now, while you're doing that, and you can see it takes a bit of focus, expand your focus beyond just the sensation of your hand and expand it to the sensation of the soles of your feet. So now you're having to really expand this focus on sensation beyond just the hand, but to the feet, and see if you can maintain that focus on the sensation of your hands and your feet. And notice how it takes a fair bit of focus to keep our attention steady on just the sensation of our hand and the soles of our feet. Now, some of you may find it weird or uncomfortable, and that's okay. We don't usually direct all our attention to feeling the sensation of our hands and feet, so it's a little weird, but there's nothing to figure out here except to just be with that. Now, what I'm curious about, if anyone would like to share, is what so far has been that experience where we just simply took all our attention, put it on the sensation of a part of our body and just put it there right now. Well, I'm curious to know what it was like for you. Does anyone like to share what that's like for them?
Feel free just to unmute and jump on in.
Guess it distracts from thinking about the other challenges that we're having.
So it kind of gave you something to focus away from something else. What did it feel like when you were doing it, in terms of just how your system felt, how you felt when you were doing it? What was it like?
I felt very calm.
Okay, nice. So that's great to know, because you know, we always could use a little bit of that in our lives. And if putting attention on our hands and feet can do that, that's an amazing thing. So it's wonderful.
You can feel the blood flow a bit in the hands and the feet.
Right. So that's something that's probably always there, but all of a sudden you can now feel what is there, but you're now paying attention to something, which is really cool. Really, really neat.
And Chris affirmed in the chat box, they said, you know, it stopped them thinking about the tight chest and allowed for a different focus.
Right. Great. Okay. So what we're discovering, which is really neat, is typically we like to talk about things in terms of the conceptual world. Whether it's a problem or whether it's anything, we're always talking about things that we're thinking about. In this particular experience, we focused on what's called a direct experience. There wasn't any thinking mediating the experience. You just literally had an experience where there was nothing to think. You just had to experience it directly. And then after the fact, you can assess it and think about it and go, oh yeah, that's nice. I noticed something or I experienced something else. But in it, there's actually very little to comment on in the actual moment of it, because it takes a lot of focus to just be in this direct experience. So in a moment, we're going to take this to the next level. And I'm going to ask you to think about something. Now, here's the experiment that we're going to explore and play with. Is I'm going to ask you to reconnect to the sensation of your hands and feet. And so you can try that now, is put attention back on your hand and your feet and just feel what that's like to bring all of your attention to bear in that area. And now what we're going to try and do is I'm going to ask you a question, but the objective here is you're not allowed to shift your focus away from the attention on your hands and feet, feeling the sensation. So that's our experiment. So if you find as you start thinking about whatever I'm going to ask you, and you have to disconnect from feeling the sensation of your hands and feet, then don't move your attention away. You just can't, because that's the experiment. We're not worried about the question as much as, can I explore the edges of a question while I'm primarily ensconced in the sensation of my hands and feet? That's the primary. So, because the objective is to see how well we can stay consciously feeling the sensation while we're trying to think about something else. So if you can now, while you're primarily focused on the sensation of your hands and feet, think about that challenge or problem, that big problem that we all started to think about at the beginning of the session here. Think about your big challenge and see what it's like if you could bring some of that in while your attention's on your hand and feet. Now, if you find you have to leave focusing on sensation to do that, don't. I want you to stay in sensation. And you may find that you can think about all of your problem, some of it, or actually none of it. It's not a problem. Either way, what's more intriguing is, what is it like for you to explore the edge of your problem while you're rooted, anchored, primarily focused on the sensation of your hand and feet? Let's just sit like that for a moment as you try to explore that. So for a moment, you can stop thinking about your problem and see if you can maintain connection to the sensation of your hands and feet. And while you do that, I'm going to try and draw your attention to a few things that you may or may not have noticed. First of all, you may have noticed how conscious you had to be to stay focused on sensation while considering your problem. And also the discipline and the focus that was required and how lucid and awake you actually had to be to do that. Now, in some cases, you may have even noticed that you weren't able to access some of the thoughts that typically you would have about the problem. And you may have even noticed an impulse almost to disconnect from sensation so that you could go and get those thoughts you'd normally have, because that's what the problem is all about. In other cases, you may have found that you had fresh thoughts or insights or a change in perspective that you hadn't previously had regarding this problem, and you may have noticed an impulse to disconnect from sensation so you could deny those new thoughts. It can happen. So what we're going to do is just take another brief moment to focus our attention on sensation of our hand and our feet, and then see if we can, from that place, try and do the same thing again with the previous iteration, where we focus on trying to bring in a little bit of that problem and explore it from this place. And if we feel we have to disconnect from sensation, or we do, we come back and we let go of the problem. And we keep trying, only bring it in if we're connected to sensation. That's the only way we want to explore this problem. notice, and stay doing this, and notice how it feels to be fully here, with your attention directly on the sensation of your hand and your feet. But in this place, you're not resisting or pushing away any discomfort by distracted thinking. Instead, you're meeting the moment as it is, directly, unmediated by thinking. And notice how much focus it takes. So there's lots of focus, but there's no busy thinking. Now, notice what happens if you just stop placing your attention on your hands and feet and simply start to think about your problem again. Something is lost. Now, this experiment, it helps us experience the benefit of anchoring our attention in sensation, as Barbara was asking at the beginning, what's the point or why would we do that, as a way to face the discomfort of something stressful. Now, as we do it, we can begin to glimpse a sense of clarity, like our instincts and our wisdom rising up from a place we can almost effortlessly trust. Now, for some of you, the experience may have been more impactful than others. And what's interesting is that regardless, what we can see is that when we open to the experiential aspect of a problem, not just the abstracted aspect of a problem, when we meet it directly, our thinking around our problem actually shifts, and so does our relationship with whatever the problem is, or the challenge is, or the stressful situation. So, taking all this into account and experience, are there any questions so far, or anything that's come up that has you kind of going, or what does that mean about something, or it didn't quite work for me, or I've got a question about this? Anything that you'd like to kick the tires on so far in this process as we move through it?
I noticed something, Jonathan. When I was trying to bring the problem back in, while I stayed with the sensation, I found it quite hard to think about the problem. You know, so that when I was thinking about it, I moved away from sensation quite quickly. But what came up as I stayed was the emotion behind the problem, the emotion I was experiencing in relation to the problem. So it wasn't the series of thoughts about it. So I could stay with the sensation in my body, and I could simultaneously stay with the emotion connected to the problem, but I couldn't do the song and dance pattern that is my typical thoughts about the problem as I define it.
Beautiful. So what you've just described is what happens when you're using more of your brain, is that your fuller intelligence is able to figure out what aspects of this problem is relevant and what isn't. So typically we try to use our thinking to kind of parse out or adjudicate the relevance of things. And it's not always so easy. But what you were describing was that when you kept your attention on the sensation of your being, for some reason, it had this interesting effect where it didn't render you emotionless. In fact, the emotional aspect of this problem became a relevant factor and said, this is something you need to face or need to feel or need to address or connect with. And everything else, it wasn't seen as relevant. I think that's actually not where the real issue lies. And can you just be with this?
Yeah.
How does that resonate for you?
Totally. And there was this corollary experience of when I sat with the emotion, the problem didn't become about the outside world. It became about how I, you know, the emotion that came up for me was disappointment. And so then the problem started to be reframed as, oh, how do I live with disappointment? What does disappointment mean to me? And all of my thinking about the problem is, how do I fix it? How would I change external circumstances? How do I make this other person different? How do I make that happen? How do I protect myself? How do I make sure nothing I don't want to have happen happens? You know, there's like a lot of managing out in the outside world. But this was like, oh, and then how I am in relation to myself and that problem is actually more in my control, because now it's about me and how I sit with my disappointment.
Absolutely, 100%. It's an amazing It's an amazing insight and perspective that's very difficult to access if we stay on that horizontal dimension. And so the vertical dimension pulls us down, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what's actually happening in our brain and what we're taken advantage of in some way with this other dimension that we bring into the equation when we're trying to address things that are pressure-filled, stressful, or problematic in many ways.
And I'd just like to ask if there's anybody else in the room right now that wants to share their experience, because I personally would love to hear from at least one other person about what the experience of staying focused on the sensation as you bring the problem is in, because I imagine folks have different, it's a different outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody up for that?
I have a thought associated with this a little bit, but it's about the amount of attention and energy it takes to focus on these things. And I wonder, it reminded me of an article or a book I read a while back, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but the concept sticks with me a bit, that human evolution, we basically developed a big brain and a big proportion of the energy that we consume, in terms of food sustenance, goes to feeding this engine that we have. And other animals have a smaller brain, but more physical prowess than we do. But we've devoted, in evolutionary terms, a lot of our energy in thinking. And when you actually are working with your mind, you consume a considerable amount of calories, in the thinking process. So as I was going through this, it seemed like the focus of the problem and the edges of the problem and the sensations of my feet and my hands and all that, it took a certain amount of effort, I found. And it occurred to me that was an energy consuming process. I wonder if you agree that that's the case.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that I know if you can relate, is you were making a fair amount of effort. And what was the level of tension like in your body with all of that effort that you were making?
I didn't notice any tension in my case.
Right. So it was fascinating. Yes. So calories are burned and effort expended. But what starts to happen is you start to see that it's expended in a way that results in something more optimal. So while in some cases when there's a misalignment with the process of using our brain, we'll expend energy, but we'll feel more tension and more stress in all kinds of areas in our body when we're trying to ruminate or figure something out. A few hours later, my neck's sore, my shoulders are tight when I'm trying to really grapple with something. And so, yes, there's definitely energy expenditure. What's more interesting, Stan, is if it's new for people, there's going to be lots of energy expenditure in the beginning. And then there's practices that I'm going to share with people that over time, this can become we can become more proficient at it, and the energy expenditure goes down significantly. So worthwhile. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
So sorry, I came in a little late and I was trying to figure out what my problem is. And I don't know that I have an urgent problem right now, but I was like thinking about this thing I want at work. And I just went to a work party. And what I noticed was as I was sitting and paying attention to my feet and my hand and kind of not thinking about what I want per se, but just notice my feet, my hand. And then all of a sudden I remembered this piece of conversation I had and I just flooded with, holy shit, did I really say that? I shouldn't have talked about that. The feeling of, I don't even what the holy shit feeling. I fucked up.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, that's really interesting that that's what comes up. And that's all I thought. So.
And what was it like to stay in the sensation of the experience with your tension on your hands and feet as you had that realization?
Just that feeling of being completely flooded with, I think, adrenaline or something, and just sitting there being like, oh yeah, that's how I feel now. And then I had a bit of like, what do I do now? And I thought, nah, don't need to think about that. So.
Was your attention on your hands and feet throughout the process?
When I started to think about what to do, no, then that's when it goes away.
what goes away?
Being able to stay in the feet hand.
So when you start to think about the problem, then your attention on your hands and feet, you disconnect from it?
No, when I started to like, so I'm like this feeling of, oh shit, I fucked up.
Yeah.
And then when I stayed with that feeling, I can focus on my hand and feet. When I move to thinking about what to do about it, I move away from hand and feet, noticing them.
So interesting. So it's not dissimilar to what Barbara was saying in that the raw emotion slash experiential aspect becomes manageable, palatable, the capacity to handle it is there, and whatever is there can wave or wash through, as long as there's an attention on the hands and feet. But if you were to disconnect from it and distract with the thinking, it would be a whole different kettle of fish in order to, it would be a very, very different outcome experience type of thing.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, sensation dimension is a marvelous dimension to explore. We often, and I'll share about a little bit more in a bit around this and where we'll go from here. So thanks, Anna. Appreciate that. So if I build on the model I showed earlier, just to step a little bit further forward in this process, you notice I've overlaid it with a pyramid shape. And the pyramid shape now shows that if we're going up this vertical, it leads to a shortening of the horizontal line. And as we come down the vertical, that horizontal line can actually extend further out. It gets longer based on the pyramid. And what this really reflects in the model is that the more stimulation we experience, the more constricted our thinking is going to be. And the less stimulation we experience, the more expansive our thinking can be. So before we move on, are there any questions about this? All good. Okay. So first of all, each interaction that we have in the world, it's providing us with information from both dimensions. The thinking dimension, of course, we know that, and the sensation dimension, we've just experienced some of that. So while thinking about our problem is very compelling, it's actually the sensation aspect of our problem that holds the key to expanding our thinking around it. So when we're actually faced with a stressful situation or a seemingly impossible problem, it's actually an invitation to explore our thinking in a deeper way. So we descend the vertical dimension to access thinking that isn't currently available. Thinking harder about a problem can't actually expand our thinking around it. Is everyone following that so far? Any questions on that? Cool. Okay, good. So why is this hard? I mean, if all we need to do is anchor our attention in the sensation dimension, why is it hard? I mean, especially when we're faced with a stressful situation. I mean, wouldn't we want to just do this and on with it? It seems to work fairly effectively. So I'll tell a little story about why, and then introduce a little bit about why it might be a little hard. So Maureen Lee, she's a mother in British Columbia. She was out picking berries one day with her daughter Maya, and a cougar jumps out and pounces on Maya, grabs her away. It rolls a few times on the ground with Maya in its arms, and then pins her down and is about to take a bite out of her throat. Now Maureen, she didn't think. She just dove onto her daughter, and she caused the cougar to grab onto her back and dig its claws into her as she stood up and somehow threw it off her back, causing it to run away. Now, Maureen's actions, they stemmed from the activation of her safety first system. It's an incredibly effective system, and it works amazingly well when we or those around us are in actual imminent physical danger. And Maureen didn't have time to consider whether it was the right or the wrong thing to do, nor did she have time to worry about whether she was going to get hurt or not, dirty or not, or even be successful or not. In the moment, it was all very pure action and reaction. So in circumstances where we aren't being threatened, few of us would put ourselves in danger by jumping on a cougar. Our thinking would tell us, not such a wise thing to do, maybe a little dangerous. However, our safety first system is amazing because it's actually able to impair the rational part of our thinking in order to save our lives. Maureen didn't think, she just jumped on her daughter. So how does the system work? So first of all, regardless of the type of life we want to live or the types of things we want to do, we can't do anything if we're not alive to do it. So we have a safety first system embedded into the base of our brains that at a fundamental level is designed to save our physical bodies from mortal danger. And it has a collection of hormones that it can release to affect our behavior in order to save our lives. Once these hormones are released into our bodies, the effects are powerful. We become hyper-aroused, very narrowly focused, our muscles tense up to fight or run from danger. Now, if the danger is real, as in the scenario with Maureen and her daughter, the release of these chemicals do their job effectively. Maureen didn't spend time thinking about what to do, she just responded. She likely experienced a narrowed focus, an elevated heart rate, increased muscle tension, all highly appropriate for her situation. However, as we've evolved, our sense of ourselves has expanded beyond just our physical bodies. It now includes our ideas of ourselves, how we see ourselves, whether we see ourselves as successful, kind, or generous, whether we see ourselves as leaders or parents or providers. All the many ways in which we identify ourselves has become our sense of who we are. And so a perceived threat to any of our identities sets off our safety first system in the same way as a perceived threat to our physical existence. For example, our desires to be seen as smart or competent or liked, if challenged, can trigger us to feel threatened. The situation where we have to convey a negative message in a performance review could lead many of us to feel a threat response. We may be afraid that the meeting will blow up and will be seen as incompetent or a failure of some sort. So anything such as a thought we have, something we hear, something we read, something we see, something we feel, something we smell, or something we taste can trigger our sense of ourselves to feel threatened in some way, releasing hormones that stimulate us. Now, while it's understandable that we experience tension when we're late for an appointment, the tension's not required. While it's understandable that we experience agitation when someone is berating us for something we didn't do, this agitation is not required. Unfortunately, when our safety first system activates, in all kinds of situations that stimulate us to feel agitated, constricted, or tense, we take this as a signal that the stakes of the situation are high. And we get very busy trying to address the situation with our thinking. So, I'm sure anyone here find themselves excessively ruminating or worrying about stressful problems and realize hours or days later how tense their neck or jaw or shoulders are. In the face of this hormonal stew, it's not so easy to simply put our attention on the sensation of our hands. Our system is convinced at some deep level that we're under threat. So this is why it's so important to have an awareness of this vertical or sensation dimension. Because at times when our safety first system is activated, we can recognize we're becoming tense, we're becoming agitated, we're becoming constricted. And if we look around and we see no physical threat to our lives in this exact moment, we can trust that the agitation and the tension and the constriction are an invitation to focus on the vertical dimension, almost like a sign, just says, the vertical dimension moment for me. Now, when we're faced with a difficult situation, something stressful that requires us to be effective, and it's not life-threatening, such as an argument with a spouse, a conversation with a doctor who doesn't seem to be listening to us, a conversation with an uncooperative Air Canada representative, I'm sure we've all had some of those, we are better served by engaging with the sensation dimension. Now, even though it will feel like we're moving away from solving our issue, the sensation dimension doesn't offer us a sense of progress, only a sense of what's here. As we descend the vertical dimension, our system recalibrates and our thinking expands, offering us previously hidden possibilities. A simple shifting of our focus onto our hands and feet in many cases can do the trick, but it does take an understanding of what's actually going on before we can build up the courage to even take the leap to do this. Now, often when we're faced with a difficult problem or challenge, something stressful, we're actually unconscious of the discomfort we're feeling. And so we may not even be aware of it. We may not be aware this is a vertical dimension issue. So while we may not be conscious of our discomfort, we'll subconsciously move to try and get rid of it using our thinking to lead the way. And if we aren't aware, we're going to do it in ways that are counterproductive to us. And we'll find ourselves ineffectively dealing with a challenging situation. So for example, if we're leading a team and a difficult issue comes up, defaulting to our particular personal tendencies may not be what the moment is calling for. We may become controlling when we need to let go. We may become aggressive when a calmer approach is required. We may become compliant when firm boundary setting is required. And all of this will appear perfectly justified by the narrowed thinking with which we're operating. But if we anchor our attention in the sensation dimension, we provide our system with an opportunity to face both the conscious discomfort, which is easier to see, and unconscious discomfort. And it moves us down the vertical, expanding our thinking and offering us a perspective that's more aligned with a broader reality beyond our narrow thinking. So this is the challenge, is the fact that when we have this primary focus on thinking, you can see as in the image, not so easy to actually address the problem. Sensation can actually help us. So when we're faced with a challenging situation, try and take the time to allow your system to settle at a deeper level before jumping into the assumptions that we think we know what it's all about. If you're facing a really stressful problem, then you'll likely be facing a strong wave of discomfort to try and move you up the vertical dimension. So stay focused and turn away from the temptation to disconnect from sensation and focus exclusively on thinking. So instead of focusing exclusively on thinking, try and put some attention on sensation. So we're going to keep your attention focused on sensation and allow it to guide you. Now, taking this counterintuitive approach, it opens up previously hidden possibilities. And however, because it's counterintuitive, it does take practice to institute in your daily life. Really, a lot of practice. So what I've put up here is a bit of a practice for rewiring our brains. Because what's interesting is that the sensation dimension, a lot of that sensation piece comes from the activation of the neurons in the parietal lobe, which governs all the sensation that we feel. Frontal lobe is where all the thinking is. Nothing wrong with it, but we want to build up the neurons firing in that lobe to increase our sensitivity so we can sense when are we feeling something, because typically we wouldn't have noticed. Oh, wow, I'm feeling some tension in my chest. So there's a common expression in the world of neuroscience. I believe they use the word neuroplasticity. I think it really means that we can actually change the way our brains are responding to stimuli and how we actually engage with the world and build relationships with it. Neurons apparently that fire together, they wire together. And so this exercise is a little bit like building up some of that neuron firing capability. So in the phase one of this exercise, what we would do is every day when you wake up, you would take 10 minutes to just put attention on the sensation of your hands and your feet. So you're lying in bed. I mean, if you have to run to the washroom when you wake up, do it, come back to bed. And then lie in bed for 10 minutes and just keep your attention focused on the sensation of your hands and feet. And see, Stan, it's going to take a fair amount of effort, as you say, a fair amount of calories burned to just keep your attention, keep coming back, but it's relaxing. And you're just going to focus and do that. And then at the end of the day, before you go to sleep, the last thing you do, you're cuddling with your partner or you're in bed and you're holding onto a cushion, you've read your book, you've done everything you need to do and you're about to go to sleep, put attention on the sensation of your hands and feet. Drift off with your attention there. And so you can bookend your day. The next phase is more interesting. Let's start to do it while we're doing activities that we feel comfortable doing, like walking the dog, making a cup of tea, having a shower, watching a really exciting show on TV that's really tense and it's a thriller. See if you can put attention on the sensation of your hands and feet while you're doing that. And as you get comfortable doing that, you'll start to build a confidence that, oh, my goodness, I can actually do this thing while I'm doing other activities. And periodically, throughout the day, phase one, I forgot to mention, was to take a minute every few hours and also put attention on the sensation of your hands and feet. So once you've done phase one and phase two, you can, when you feel comfortable and confident, you can jump into phase three. And phase three is focusing on sensation while doing more complex activities, like having difficult conversations. Because typically we believe, I'm not ready to do that because I need all of my horizontal dimension thinking brain to do this activity. But as you build a little bit of confidence, you'll realize you can actually fundamentally engage any activity from the sensation dimension. So you can have difficult conversations, you can crunch numbers at work and do deeper thinking in spreadsheets. You can do all kinds of things to explore as you get comfortable. Now, what's going to happen is that once you realize you can mine your deeper intelligence, you may feel compelled to keep practicing it. And once you practice it, you're going to discover the value your deeper intelligence brings and what it takes to access it. And you'll begin to trust it in the process for connecting with it. And in this way, as you practice incorporating sensation into the equation of solving your problems and addressing your stressful situations and supporting and anchoring you in these moments, you'll develop a new way of operating where sensation becomes the primary dimension from which you're operating. And your deeper intelligence will start to inform all your choices. And this is how, little by little, we can become more effective thinkers in times of stress. So are there any questions so far with regards to any of what we've just discussed?
Yeah, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything magical about hand and feet? Or is
Well,
anything sensational? Okay,
the magical
physical.
thing about it is it's the least obstructive, offensive, difficult. It's the easiest thing to do. So all the other parts of your body, at some level, if I said notice your breathing or focus on your chest or your throat, there are areas that it becomes problematic to do in that particular moment. But your hands and your feet, they don't seem to get too involved in everything. So they're away from the fray. So you can actually put attention, no matter what's going on your body, you could put it on your hands and feet, and I can relax my hands and feet because even though my chest feels like it's going to explode right now, I can at least relax my hands. And so it becomes a much easier accessible point into engaging with that physical vertical sensation.
Yes, makes sense.
Any other questions regarding the relationship between the sensation and your problems and how to expand your thinking when you're actually engaging in putting attention on sensation?
Yeah, one thing that occurred to me is that when you happen to have pain, it tends to be a focus that you commingle with the other things that you're doing in your day. So ironically, one could experience this focus on the sensation, physical sensation, not necessarily by choice, but by the nature of this kind of intrusive discomfort that you feel, and it winds up occupying a certain amount of your concentration, either trying to mitigate it or trying to not not feel too bad about it. I wonder if that winds up conflicting with or being kind of like an accessory, like a benefit, a silver lining to the cloud of your pain by making it possible to focus on something else.
Well, I think first of all, I want to draw a distinction between the functioning of a relatively healthy person who's experiencing stress on a day-to-day basis and using the connection with their physical body in order to expand their thinking, and someone who's in a tremendous amount of pain that's overwhelming them. Because when we're in a tremendous amount of pain that's overwhelming us, it literally takes up all of our consciousness to relate to it. Now, ultimately, people who have built up a tremendous capacity to experience sensation can have a higher degree of tolerance for discomfort and uncomfortable feelings, where they won't be expending as much energy when that kind of pain appears. They have a way to relax into it, where it's experienced more on the realm of sensation than it is in the realm of this thing called pain. That would be someone who's practiced for a long time in terms of feeling sensations in their bodies, and all kinds of uncomfortable ones. The average person, I would say, is, you got a lot of pain, you got a lot of pain. And I don't know, I mean, maybe at some level, sure, the pain can take away from their focus on trivial day-to-day activities because they're taken up by it. But it's not really, I mean, it may be related, but it's not really something that we're talking about here. What you're talking about is it kind of reminds me of the story of a friend of mine who had a pain in their leg, and another friend came up to him and punched him in the arm and said, "How's the pain in the leg now?" And he said, "Well, it's actually kind of gone away." I was like, "Exactly, because pain in the arm is kind of it's not necessarily the most helpful way to deal with the issue." And that's a little bit like what you're describing with a lot of pain. So
Can I jump in here just for a minute? Because one of the things we might do therapeutically if someone's living with a lot of physical pain, we would use the same practice of mindfulness, but the pain gets framed as the problem, like the problem of life. So I'm living with pain. And so then the invitation would be, is there a place in your body that you can experience without pain? And what is that sensation? And then you focus on that place. So the practice of still bringing purposeful focus to sensation can work in a body with pain if they're able to find a spot that doesn't have pain, because then you practice living with the sensation of pain, aka the problem, and the sensation of not pain. And the sensation of not pain helps us drop in that triangle that you described. With such an easy image. It helps the person drop down in that triangle, but the pain lifts you up in that. Whether it comes with anxious thoughts or not, pain still evokes a movement up that where our thinking does get smaller and our focus gets smaller, and we become less effective in our capacity to we'll face the pain and deal with other life circumstances. And so I think the strategy can still be so helpful. We just put the physical pain into the category that thing you started with, Jonathan, which was like, okay, think of a problem. Okay, here's our problem. Now, if pain's in their hands, we're going to come up with something else. But
yeah, that's absolutely beautiful and very accurate. I just want to be also mindful of people who are in such tremendous pain, where the capacity to even kind of find that space isn't really there.
100%. Yeah.
But that, by the way, is not dissimilar to someone who is really overwhelmed by something at some level, at the thinking level, that is so overwhelming to them to think about that they can't find space to put attention on their hands and feet. They're like, no, later. I just still first need to figure this thing out before I'll even find the space for that, because it's just too overwhelming. So there are people that could be in that place. And what's really helpful is when they have support and other people helping work with them to be able to find an access point or a space to go to help them move down that vertical.
Yeah, and it's this real leap of faith at some point for someone who is that overwhelmed or in that much pain, whether it's psychological or physical, to risk shifting their attention away from that overwhelm. It's
Right.
scary, and so this process is quite a radical process, quite a radical invitation, actually, to folks who are in those states of being, the overwhelmed states.
Right. And one of the things we were talking about was just how that safety first system plays a role in making it so scary and feeding people's resistance to wanting to do it. because it feels like the stakes are high and something bad's going to happen, or I won't make the progress that I thought I would make, or I'm going to lose ground if I do this, or I'm not really going to address it. I'm wasting my time here. I've got to get on with it, and actually something else needs to be bigger and better in order for me to really stamp out this problem. So that safety first system, we have to be careful of underestimating its potency and power. But people who really are willing to face that, in a sense, it's a bit of a fear of a mini death in some ways, because it's a death of my fear of not being liked, or my whatever that thing is that's going on that we're attached to and identified with. If we're willing to face it at a biological level, not a conceptual level, but really the feelings of that are surfacing, then it becomes a game changer in terms of what's possible. We discover on the other side of that an entire field of possibility that was just kind of just waiting for us to take a leap of faith and find our way there. So this is the gist, the main this is the essence of what I wanted to convey in this workshop, was a small framing to change people's perspective of this idea of thinking when they're under stress. Because when we're under stress and we're caught up in our thoughts, we're typically mostly engaging at that horizontal level. And to create a little model that could show people, well, maybe there's a different way. You can come down this vertical and engage at the level of sensation. You offer yourself a lifeline to explore this stressful situation in a way that you wouldn't have done before. And so hopefully this has been helpful for people and useful in terms of exploring the
Can I
concept.
ask a question of you, Jonathan? And there might be
Sure.
other questions on the floor here, but I would love to hear a story that points to the experience of someone who moved from that upper part of the triangle down, because there's a piece of me that wants to know, what does more creative thinking look like in that moment? You know, what's the magic of it, or what is the process of, as you drop down, how does your thinking, and I don't know if you have like somebody you've worked with, or there's a specific example in your own life where you're like, hey, this is how it transpired.
So a few things. It's always it's a very unique experience for everybody. So in terms of what it looks like in terms of the creativity aspect, I think that the thing I'd say about the creativity aspect is it's the aspect where we're surprised by either our capacity to stay with something that we couldn't stay with, our capacity to hear something that we couldn't hear before, our capacity to continue to do something in a soft way, despite the fact that we're going to really do it harshly. Now, as far as the story, I think, an interesting one is just a few hours before this workshop, I was chatting with a client of mine, and I was telling him I was going to do a workshop specifically on helping people explain their thinking under stress. And he said, well, why don't you tell a story about me? I said, what do you mean about you? He said, well, you know, the last month and a half of my life has been absolutely insane. And if it wasn't for the work we've been doing in terms of how you go about handling stressful situations, I would have been completely off the races. So a few years ago, actually, when we started working together, he came to me because he was really struggling, and he's an executive in his own business that he's built, and he called me not because he really wanted anything help with strategically in his work. He actually called me because he was struggling in his relationship, and he started to describe how he was approaching his relationship. And I remember at the time said to him, well, it's interesting, you're a little bit like a one-trick pony. I mean, you're really good at bringing a hammer to a particular issue. And when the issue requires a hammer, it's great. But when the issue requires something other than a hammer, you don't have anything in your arsenal. And so it sounds like what we need to do is cultivate a whole suite of different ways in which you can respond to something other than with just the hammer. And so over the years, we've been working on exactly this experience of being more attuned to the sensation of what's here, not trying to inquire on what is my chest telling me about this, but just be in the sensation of the experience and having the sensation experience inform him after traveling a little down the vertical, what there else is that he can do in life. And so over the last month, I think he mentioned to me I think they'd gotten a new dog. They were up every 2 hours with this dog for about 9 weeks, where they all in the household had no sleep. So everyone was really stressed, no sleep. And on the back end of that, he had someone come in and steal $200,000 from his business bank account. And as he was trying to resolve that on pretty much no sleep, they shut down his business bank account. And this is a large business, and he's trying to run it, and he's got to pay employees, and he's got to pay vendors. His wife then got sick and had to go into the hospital and had a procedure that then went bad. And so he had to deal with that. And so he's going through all of these things, and he's almost like in this rolling from one crazy experience to the next, and they're all turning out kind of okay at the end of the day. But in the mix of the whole thing, what he's amazed with, or amazed by, is just his capacity to be able to meet these things in a way, these situations, in a way where it's giving him a shot at engaging it in the more optimal fashion. And so that's an example of how, in terms of how he can come to navigate these wild and wacky waters, stressful times where thinking can expand, but it doesn't expand in, I now know what to do, other than at the time it just says, I know enough not to lose my entire sense of self on this particular person at the bank who's shutting down my account. It's not going to take me anywhere. I'm not going to die if it doesn't happen. It may feel like it, but I can actually try and stay with the situation as best as I possibly can. And so, yeah, he was just saying how grateful he is for having come to this and being able to kind of discover for himself what it is it's got to show him on the back end of his willingness to be present to something in a much more deeper and more direct way. Does that answer anything?
Thank you. It really does. It really does. Because the piece that you said that's really stood out to me was, it's not like you are magically going to have better ideas in that like grand scheme of planning, but that in the moment your capacity changes to face what's happening and gives you a greater flexibility, right? Gives you a greater range of options in that moment that actually stands to allow for a more optimal outcome, right? So
Yeah.
there's almost a sort of subtle under or soft expansion that allows you to move with what's happening.
Yep, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, and it evolves and grows over time and constantly surprises us. But I think what it does is it allows us to have a more mysterious journey, rather than one where we've already decided how it's got to go, what it's all about, what my limits are, what the situation means, and to be surprised by what could actually happen if we're willing to just put our attention onto something other than our parts of ourselves that promise this future perfection, that if you just think about it just a little bit harder, it's going to solve the problem. It's like, no, actually come back to being here and see if just your very presence right now can actually help solve this.
Jonathan, you mentioned your gentleman who was being buffeted by all these horrendous, large, just all coming one after the other. But other than, you're in the midst of this maelstrom, do you have a mental model for how people go about thinking through big problems? Like for myself, I tend to get in front of my computer and type resolution to it, or I'll be in the shower and I'll be thinking about it, or I'll be laying in bed. I've got these different modes where I'm thinking through challenging or at least problems to work through in a systematic sort of way without being overwhelmed by the emotions of it. When you're focused, you're talking about this sort of approach where you don't sit there deep thinking, like the thinker with your hand on your chin, but you're focused on your hands or your feet or the sensation. It seems to be, in contrast to some thinker mode, where you're sitting there just in your head and trying to focus your attention as opposed to doing something physical like feeling the water come over you in the shower or typing on a keyboard and trying to make sure that the fonts, line up properly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure totally. Let me see if I understand. It's you're
Let me see if I could frame it slightly differently. So the contrast between just sitting and thinking through a problem without focusing your attention on the physical seems to be this dichotomy between you're completely in your head and you're not physically doing anything, and you're going to take your attention and focus on the physical. In contrast to doing something where your thinking process is centered around some physical activity like typing words into a keyboard, or you happen to be in the shower and using the temperature and the physical, water coming over your head as a distracting element that helps you clarify these kind of things. I think there's a different ways and different modes that people attack the problems, and sometimes they're more like, you'll find the shower is the best place where I can do some deep thinking because I don't have all the other distractions going on, or in bed when I'm lying in bed at night, I could really put everything aside and focus specifically on a challenge.
Mhm.
People have different modes of thinking effectively through problems, and the method you describe, I'm not sure if it takes all those different moments in the day into consideration. That's the question.
Yeah, you're right. You're 100% correct. Everyone has so many different ways of being able to access deeper aspects of themselves. What I've found, the reason I advocate this particular technique is because I work with a lot of people who are at work. There isn't a shower, and there isn't a hiking trail, and they're in a boardroom, and they're right in the middle of a conversation where they've got to, in that moment, show up. And there are people triggering them and people berating them, and they're trying to get their thoughts together and become clear and offer the best of themselves. And so in the midst of life, when I'm driving my car or I'm in a conversation with someone and they want me right there to be present and I just struggle, it's like, well, how am I going to show up now? What can I do? Your hands and your feet are right here. They're not away. You don't have to go and turn on the tap or you can build a proficiency to being here with what is going on in a way that can just give you some access to just a little bit of expanded thinking. Doesn't mean that you can't find ways to clear your head if you're an author or something and you need to write. And some people say, well, I need to go for long hikes. So, one of the things I heard was, what's the Galapagos Island guy who was, what's that? Darwin, yes. So Charles Darwin, apparently, deep thinker, but used to go for massive long walks, like for hours and hours in nature. It was this thing that he advocated, was this whole thing. And so everyone's going to have a different approach to finding their way to tap into their wisdom and their greater thinking and all of that. This is just a simple, convenient way that anyone can pick up and practice and use on a day-to-day basis in our crazy, busy, nutty world, where access to simplicity and a physical, tangible part of our being is very, very difficult to come by because of how distracting everything is. So that's really what the purpose of this is, more than anything else.
Thank you. That's good.
Jonathan, it's so funny you use the example, not that I'm going to compare myself to Darwin, but because when you were describing that, I was thinking, oh, when I was writing my thesis, I'd be writing and reading academic and all like stands, talk about all up in my head, just thinking, smashing thoughts together and ideas. And then I'd hit a point and I'd be like, I got nothing left. Stuck. I don't know my next sentence. I don't have another thought. I'm just like, and if I sat there and tried to pull more out of my brain, I would like drove me crazy. And then I would get up, I'd leave the house and I'd go walk with the dog. And I'd walk for as long as I needed to, and I wouldn't think about the problem until something came up. And that spaciousness allowed a different creative thing. And then I'd have it, and then I'd get to go back to being just kind of in my brain and enjoying that academic process. But I couldn't stay just in the brain. And I also couldn't stay just in the sensation. Like this ebb and flow between those different states and those different focus or foci, whatever focuses, allowed for me to get to through that process of writing, you know, my paper in the long run.
Yeah, it's so delightful. So first of all, how fortunate that you knew what it would take to be able to access more of what it is you needed, that you didn't over-rotate and keep pushing in the wrong direction, which a lot of people can do and then burn out. So good to, very fortunate to have come to that or intuitively know that. Yeah, and there's no question that this is that a lot of what we're talking about is finding spaciousness in the midst of seemingly no space. Ultimately, that's a lot of what this is about.
Jonathan,
Mm.
For me, because I haven't, as you know, I have been practicing some of these techniques because I had the pleasure of working with you somewhat. And to me, it's very much about being in the present, like just being right here, right now with what's actually going on, rather than, like, for me, when I get in the pure thinking brain, it's actually not even thinking, it's rehearsed thought. And then when because I'm also a writer, like there's something very physical about, there's a very physical sensation that goes with being in a writing body, right? So there's something about, I think what I'm trying to articulate is that it doesn't just seems to be a juxtaposition of thought and physicality, or thought and sensation, but that thought has an anchor in the body, right? And that it's about, that there's something about when my thoughts are just like, when I think about, I really want this thing, how am I going to get this thing? I'll never get this thing because somebody like me never gets this. I'm just in a rehearsed thought place. That's actually not thinking in a expansive sense. It's a qualitatively different thing than, oh gosh, I really want that. Wouldn't it be nice if that happened? Hey, there's somebody asking me if I want that. Yeah, I actually do want that. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, in fact,
I don't know.
yeah. So you're describing various types of thinking
Yeah.
in terms of their quality and
Yes.
in terms of their potency and effect, and their healthiness in some ways. And you're right about the fact that there isn't any real, technically, sensation and thinking are just sensation and thinking. Like, who's saying one's better or worse than the other? They're just sensation and thinking. What we do know is that so if you said to me, what's 4 times 4? I'm like, I don't need to be in sensation to tell you. I don't need higher, like, I can think. The challenge is that in our day-to-day experience, we would do well to bring together the sensation and the thinking, not because they aren't together. The truth is you're feeling your bum on the chair, whether you are aware of it or not. And so all we're really doing is you're just making people aware of your thinking and of your sensation and where you're choosing to put your attention. And typically when we're stressed, our Western approach to things is we over-rotate on the thinking side to solve it and situate. It may not be, maybe in some cultures, it might not be the best thing to advocate to put your attention on sensation, because inherently maybe the focus isn't anchored in thinking the way we are. And so what we're doing really is just saying, well, if we're at our max, or if we're encountering something stressful or problematic, or I'm not sure what the hell I'm going to do about that, or this is just way more than I can figure out, then instead of kind of going, well, let me think harder about that, we can go, you know what? What happens if I put my attention on that sensation dimension to to bring together more of what's already here anyway? It's just I'm kind of overlooking it, and I'm getting caught up in more of what's not here, which is my thoughts about all kinds of things that are abstracted to the nth degree. And so that's really what it's about, as much as it's not really about preferring a sensation dimension over a thinking, or either way. It's about trying to integrate the two. I made a note a little while ago because I was doing a workshop a few days ago, and someone, I think, wanted to know what was the definition of deeper intelligence. And so in this model, and so I had to like really think about it, and I came up with this thing. It says, well, deeper intelligence is the integration of the vertical and horizontal dimensions, not the intersection, but the integration of it. And so when we bring in our awareness of both in a deeper, in a clear way, and it integrates, then intelligence comes from that, the deeper intelligence. So I think, yeah.
I am just keenly aware of time, and also keenly aware of my gratitude for you, Jonathan, and your creative heart and soul here. I want to just put it out to the circle. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who might want to bring something before we finish, have a question or a comment? And just make sure all voices that need to be heard get that opportunity.
Yeah, Jonathan, I just wanted to say that was an awesome talk. Great job. I really look forward to trying to implement the sensation dimension, into the problems that come up during my day. I think it's really neat and cool, and yeah, it's just so that you don't get so narrowly focused on the problem, and you kind of take a step back, take a breath, fo be in the present, focus on, sensation, and I think that allows for clearer thinking ultimately. So yeah, that was really cool. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
I think that was Mark.
That was Mark.
Oh, it's Mark. Okay. I didn't realize I have a. Oh, Mark, I didn't realize I had that over there.
Yeah.
I didn't have all the folks on the call in my visible. Okay.
Thanks for inviting me. This was fun. Great.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, Stan. Awesome. Very cool. Nice.
There are no more questions for tonight. I think this is a beautiful spot to kind of land and wrap up. We will be sending out the recording, so keep your eye on your inbox. If it doesn't show up in the next 2 days, it's probably in your junk folder, so check that out. And please feel free to share it with folks. We will be putting it up on Redbird Therapy's YouTube channel, and I just think there are so many gems here that it's worth sharing. So again, Jonathan, thank you so, so much for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks everyone for attending and playing along and engaging fully with me as well.